There are certain cases in the long history of my association with Sherlock Holmes which return to me with unusual clarity. They are not always the most violent or the most celebrated. Sometimes it is the quiet setting of a country district, the sound of a carriage upon a lonely road, or the memory of an old fireplace in a country hotel that brings the past back to me. The Boscombe Valley Mystery is one such case. It began, as so many of our adventures had begun, with a message from Holmes. At the time, I was living a quieter life with my wife, and my medical duties occupied much of my attention. One morning, while we were seated at breakfast, the maid brought in a telegram. It was from Sherlock Holmes. He wished to know whether I could spare a couple of days. He had been summoned to west of England in connection with what was described as the Boscombe Valley tragedy. He invited me to accompany him, adding with characteristic simplicity that the air and scenery were perfect. My wife encouraged me to go. She knew that my old association with Holmes had brought me many strange experiences, and she also believed that a change from my ordinary routine would do me good. I needed little persuasion. My years of military service had taught me to travel quickly when necessary. I packed a small valise, took a cab, and soon found myself on my way to Paddington Station. Holmes was waiting upon the platform. I recognized him at once. His tall, lean figure was wrapped in a long traveling cloak, and he wore a close-fitting cloth cap. He greeted me warmly, and I could see that my presence pleased him. Holmes valued reliable companionship when working in unfamiliar surroundings. Local assistance, he often said, could be influenced by local opinions. We soon settled into a railway carriage. Holmes had brought with him a considerable collection of newspapers. For some time he read through them carefully, occasionally making notes and pausing to think. The countryside passed steadily beyond the window, while the rhythm of the train gave our journey a peaceful quality. Eventually, Holmes put the newspapers aside. He had already studied the reports of the case. The tragedy had occurred in Boscombe Valley, a rural district not far from Ross, in Herefordshire. The victim was a man named Charles McCarthy, an Australian settler who had established himself in England. He occupied Hatherley Farm, which belonged to a wealthier neighbor named John Turner. The two men had known one another in Australia. Their shared past had brought them into close association after they returned to England. Turner was the richer of the two, while McCarthy lived as his tenant. Despite this difference, the men had remained on friendly terms and were often seen together. Each had one child. McCarthy had a son, James, a young man of about 18. Turner had a daughter, Alice, also about 18. Both families lived somewhat apart from the surrounding English society. Their lives were private, and the two households were connected by the old friendship between their fathers. It was on a Monday afternoon that the tragedy occurred. McCarthy had left Hatherley Farm at about 3 o'clock. He walked toward Boscombe Pool, a small lake formed where a stream widened through the valley. He had apparently arranged to meet someone there. That detail would later become one of the most important facts in the entire mystery. Several people saw McCarthy walking toward the pool. Among them was William Crowder, a gamekeeper employed by Turner. Crowder also saw James McCarthy following in the same general direction, carrying. At first, there seemed to be nothing unusual about this, but near the pool, the situation changed. A young girl named Patience Moran had been picking flowers in the surrounding woodland. From among the trees, she saw Charles McCarthy and his son. Together, they appeared to be engaged in a violent quarrel. The girl became frightened and hurried away. Not long afterward, James McCarthy appeared at the nearby lodge in a state of great excitement. His father had been found badly injured beside the pool. The body was lying upon the grass. The back of McCarthy's head had been shattered by repeated blows from some heavy, blunt object. His son's gun was found nearby, and the injuries were such that the butt of the weapon might easily have caused them. There were other circumstances that seemed even more damaging to the young man. His right hand and sleeve were stained with fresh blood. His hat and gun were missing when he first arrived at the lodge, and witnesses had seen him near his father shortly before the murder. James McCarthy was arrested. The evidence appeared almost overwhelming, yet Holmes was never satisfied by evidence merely because it appeared overwhelming. He explained to me that the case was one of those deceptively simple mysteries which can be among the most difficult to solve. When facts seemed to point too easily in one direction, he believed it was often worth asking whether they might look different from another angle. The young man's behavior after the discovery of his father's body was also curious. When he was informed that he was under arrest, he did not appear surprised. Instead, he accepted the situation with a strange remark, suggesting that his arrest was no more than he deserved. To the police and the coroner, this seemed almost like an admission of guilt. Holmes saw it differently. An innocent man who had quarreled with his father, then found that father murdered, while he himself stood nearby, might naturally feel responsible in some emotional sense. He might blame himself for the quarrel even while having nothing to do with the killing. That possibility interested Holmes. The young man's own account of the events contained still more curious details. He had recently returned from Bristol after an absence of several days. His father had gone out before James returned home. Later, James took his gun and walked toward the rabbit warren beyond Boscombe Pool. He claimed that he had not known his father was ahead of him. Near the pool, however, he heard the familiar Australian call of cooey, a signal which had often passed between father and son. He followed the sound and found his father waiting near the water. A quarrel followed. James eventually walked away, leaving his father alive. Then he heard a terrible cry from behind him. He returned and found his father dying upon the ground. The young man insisted that he had seen no attacker, yet he remembered something unusual. As he ran toward his father, he thought he saw something gray lying upon the ground near the edge of the wood. It might have been a coat or a piece of cloth. Later, when he looked again, it had disappeared. There was also a final clue. As Charles McCarthy lay dying, he appeared to utter a word concerning a rat. It seemed meaningless. The coroner regarded these details as further evidence against James. Holmes, however, was not convinced. Indeed, he seemed increasingly interested. At that time, I could not understand what Holmes had already begun to notice. We continued our journey westward, leaving the busy world of London behind us. The railway carried us through the countryside, and the changing landscape gave the journey a calmness that contrasted strangely with the grim subject we had come to investigate. Holmes eventually closed his eyes and settled into his seat, saying little more about the case. I studied the fields beyond the glass and thought about the young man waiting trial. If his story were true, then an unknown person had met Charles McCarthy at Boscombe Pool, attacked him from behind, and escaped without being seen. But who could this mysterious visitor have been? The answer, as I would later discover, was hidden in several small details which most people had dismissed. We arrived at Ross in the afternoon. A familiar figure was waiting upon the platform. It was Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. He had come to meet us and had already arranged rooms at the local hotel. His manner suggested that he considered the case practically settled. To Lestrade, the evidence against James McCarthy was straightforward. Holmes listened without argument. He had already begun forming his own opinion. Soon afterward, young woman arrived at the hotel. She was Alice Turner, the daughter of John Turner. Her concern was unmistakable. She believed absolutely in James McCarthy's innocence. She had known him since childhood and regarded the accusation against him as impossible to accept. Her presence added another layer to the mystery. Alice revealed that James and his father had often quarreled over the subject of marriage. Charles McCarthy strongly wished his son to marry Alice, while James had resisted the idea. This, she believed, explained the quarrel at the pool. There was also something important about Alice's own father. John Turner had once lived in Australia. He had made his fortune there, in the gold mining country around Victoria. Holmes paid particular attention to that fact. He asked about Turner's health and learned that the older man was seriously ill. The shock of McCarthy's death had affected him greatly, and his doctors considered his condition extremely serious. When Alice left, the room became quiet. Holmes remained thoughtful. The connection between Turner and McCarthy, their years in Australia, the strange call heard beside the pool, and the dying man's mysterious reference to a rat were beginning to form a pattern. But I could not yet see it. Holmes, however, had already decided that the obvious solution was not necessarily the true one. He intended to visit James in prison before examining the scene of the crime. The case had only just begun, and somewhere in the peaceful countryside of Boscombe Valley, the smallest traces of a hidden crime were waiting patiently for Sherlock Holmes to find them. Little did I know that those traces would eventually lead us far beyond the quiet fields of Herefordshire into a secret buried many years earlier on the other side of the world. By the time Holmes and I had settled into our rooms at the hotel in Ross, the light of the afternoon had begun to soften. The town itself was quiet, with the ordinary sounds of country life drifting through the streets. Carriage wheels passed from time to time, and somewhere beyond the buildings a church bell marked the hour. Yet the events at Boscombe Pool seemed very close. Holmes had arranged to visit James McCarthy in prison. Lestrade possessed the necessary authority, and Holmes decided that there was little value in wasting the evening. I remained behind. The quiet of the hotel gave me time to consider everything we had learned. The evidence against James seemed remarkably strong. He had followed his father toward the pool with a gun. A witness had seen the two men quarreling. The young man's hand and sleeve were stained with blood. His gun had been found close to the body. He had also admitted that he had argued with his father shortly before the death, and yet there were details which refused to fit comfortably. The dying reference to a rat was one. The gray object was another. Most important of all was the cry of "Coo-ee!" If James had truly been away in Bristol, his father could not have known that he had returned. Why then had Charles McCarthy used their private Australian signal before apparently becoming aware that his son was anywhere near him? I found myself returning again and again to that question. I took up the local newspaper and read the account of the inquest more carefully. The medical evidence attracted my attention. The fatal injuries were at the rear and left side of the skull. The force had been considerable. Whatever weapon had been used, it had struck the victim with enough strength to shatter the bone. I considered the position in which James and his father had been seen. They had been facing one another during their quarrel. That seemed significant. A blow from the front would not naturally produce the injuries described by the surgeon. Of course, a man could turn at the final moment, but this would have to be considered rather and assumed. I began to wonder whether the physical evidence might quietly contradict the story that appeared so obvious. Still, I had learned through long experience that my own medical observations could never equal Holmes' ability to interpret a collection of small facts. I therefore waited. The hours passed slowly. By evening, Holmes returned. He entered the room with his usual calm manner, removed his traveling coat, and settled himself comfortably. His visit to the prison had apparently given him little information. James McCarthy, he told me, seemed genuinely bewildered. Holmes had considered the possibility that the young man might know the identity of the murderer and be protecting that person. But after speaking with him, Holmes had become convinced that James knew no more than he had stated. There was, however, another matter concerning the young man. James was deeply in love with Alice Turner. His refusal to marry her was not due to a lack of affection. The truth was far more complicated. Several years earlier, before he had truly known Alice, James had married a barmaid in Bristol. The marriage had been kept secret. He had been young, inexperienced, and unable to see how badly this decision would affect his future. Now that he loved Alice, the secret marriage had become a terrible burden. His father knew nothing of it. This explained why James had refused to discuss the subject of his quarrel before the coroner. Speaking openly would have exposed the secret and brought shame upon himself and Alice. It also explained why he had been so distressed during the argument with his father. His father's pressure had placed him in an impossible position. Holmes considered this information important, but it did not solve the murder. In fact, it raised another question. If James was innocent, who had killed Charles McCarthy? Holmes returned to the two facts that seemed most important. First, McCarthy had gone to Boscombe Pool because he expected to meet someone. Second, he had called "Cooey" before he could possibly have known that James was nearby. The cry was an Australian signal. That suggested that the person McCarthy expected to meet has some connection with Australia. Holmes then pointed out another detail. McCarthy had been killed in a secluded area surrounded by woodland. Someone unfamiliar with the district found it difficult to approach and escape without attracting attention. The murderer, therefore, probably knew the area. That reduced the possibilities considerably. The following morning arrived clear and dry. Holmes had been concerned about the weather. He did not want rain to destroy whatever traces remained upon the ground. At 9 o'clock, Lestrade arrived with a carriage. We set off toward Hatherley Farm and Boscombe Pool. During the journey, Lestrade mentioned that John Turner was dangerously ill. The old man's health had apparently deteriorated badly since the murder. This interested Holmes. Turner had been a close friend of McCarthy's. He had also helped the family financially and had allowed McCarthy to occupy Hatherley Farm without paying rent. Such generosity was unusual. Holmes quietly considered the relationship between the two men. McCarthy had little wealth of his own, yet he had remained closely connected with Turner for many years. There was another curious matter. McCarthy had been strongly in favor of a marriage between his son and Turner's daughter. Turner himself had opposed the idea. Holmes seemed to find this arrangement strange. If McCarthy was dependent upon Turner, why would he confidently press for a marriage that Turner clearly did not want? Lestrade had little patience for such deductions. He preferred what he called hard facts. Holmes smiled. The carriage continued along the country road. Soon Hatherley Farm appeared before us. It was a comfortable two-story building with gray walls and a slate roof, but the house now looked strangely lifeless. The windows were covered, the chimneys were cold, and the whole place seemed weighed down by the tragedy. Inside, Holmes asked to see the boots worn by Charles McCarthy on the day of his death. He also examined a pair belonging to James, although they were not the ones the young man had worn that afternoon. Holmes studied the boots carefully. He measured them from several points and then asked to be taken outside. We followed the track from the farm toward Boscombe Pool. It was here that I saw Holmes change. The quiet, thoughtful man I knew from Baker Street seemed to disappear. His entire attention was concentrated upon the ground. He walked slowly at first, studying the path and the surrounding grass. Then he stopped. He moved a few paces to one side and examined the earth again. Lestrade watched with impatience. I watched with fascination. To me, the countryside appeared ordinary. To Holmes, it was a page filled with writing. The ground was damp, and many footprints had been left upon the path. Some belonged to those who had come after the murder, making the work more difficult. Holmes did not complain. He separated the older marks from the newer ones. At times he followed a particular trail. At others, he moved into the meadow before returning to the path. Eventually, we reached Boscombe Pool. It was a small sheet of water surrounded by reeds and woodland. The land was divided between Hatherley Farm and the Turner estate. The area near the pool was quiet and secluded. Lestrade pointed out the exact place where McCarthy's body had been discovered. The damp earth still preserved traces of what had happened. Holmes crouched beside them. He examined the impressions left by the young man's boots. There were several distinct sets. 2 showed James walking. Another showed that he had run. The pattern supported James's account. When he had returned after hearing the cry, he had indeed rushed toward his father. Then Holmes noticed another series of marks. These were different. They belonged to someone wearing an unusual pair of boots. The tracks appeared and disappeared among the grass. The stranger had approached carefully, at times walking on his toes. The footprints were particularly distinctive. The boots had thick soles, and their shape could be clearly recognized in the softer earth. Holmes followed the trail. It led toward the woodland. There, beneath the large beech tree, the tracks became more difficult to follow. Holmes examined the ground closely. He searched among fallen leaves, small branches, and patches of moss. Then he found something. He picked up a small stone. It appeared entirely ordinary to me. There was no obvious blood upon it. Holmes examined it with his lens and carefully placed it in his pocket. He also studied the surrounding ground and even examined the bark of the great tree. Something about the tree had clearly interested him. After some time, he followed the trail farther through the wood until it reached the high road. Their tracks disappeared. Holmes returned to his ordinary manner. He seemed satisfied. As we made our way back toward the carriage, he carried the stone with him. Lestrade remained unconvinced. Holmes finally showed him the stone and stated quietly that it had been the murder weapon. Lestrade could see no mark upon it. Holmes explained that there did not need to be one. The grass beneath the stone showed that it had only been lying there for a few days. There was no nearby place from which it appeared to have been taken. Its shape and weight were consistent with the injuries found upon McCarthy. It was, in Holmes's view, the weapon. Then came the more extraordinary conclusion. From the footprints and the traces around the tree, Holmes had formed a description of the murderer. He believed the man was tall. He was left-handed. He limped on his right leg. He wore thick-soled shooting boots. He had a gray cloak. He smoked Indian cigars and used a cigar holder. He also carried a blunt penknife. Lestrade listened with increasing disbelief. Holmes did not argue. He simply said that each detail had been obtained from a physical trace. Then he announced that he considered the mystery solved. Lestrade naturally wanted to know the name of the criminal. Holmes did not give it. Instead, he left Lestrade to consider the description for himself. The detective was not impressed. He could hardly begin searching the countryside for an unknown left-handed man with a lame leg, thick boots, and a gray cloak. Holmes remained perfectly calm. The carriage carried us back toward Ross. I could not help wondering how Holmes had arrived at such a precise description on the handful of footprints and a little ash beneath a tree. Yet I had learned long ago that the apparent smallness of a clue meant nothing to Sherlock Holmes. A footprint, to an ordinary observer, was merely a footprint. To Holmes, it might reveal a man's height, his manner of walking, the weight he placed upon each leg, the kind of boots he wore, and even something about his physical condition. The countryside remained peaceful around us. Birds moved among the hedges, the road stretched quietly beneath the wheels, and the distant houses stood beneath the clear morning sky. But somewhere within that peaceful landscape, Holmes had already identified the path taken by a murderer. There was still one question: who was the man? And why had Charles McCarthy expected to meet him beside Boscombe Pool? The answer was beginning to emerge from the past. At the time, however, I knew only that Holmes had discovered something which Lestrade had entirely missed. And I had no idea how deeply the answer would be connected with the history of Australia, the goldfields of Victoria, and the troubled life of John Turner. The journey back to Ross was quiet. Holmes sat opposite me with the small stone resting in his pocket, while Lestrade seemed determined to preserve his doubts. I had become accustomed to the contrast between the two men. Lestrade trusted what could be placed before a court. Holmes trusted what could be discovered before it ever reached a courtroom. For my own part, I remained fascinated by the footprints. The murder had taken place in a quiet corner of the countryside, yet the earth seemed to have preserved a record of the events. James McCarthy's movements were there, his father's movements were there, and among them were the stranger's tracks. Holmes had followed those tracks to the great beech tree. There he had found the stone, but the identity of the man who had carried that stone remained hidden. When we reached the hotel, Holmes asked me to sit with him for lunch. Lestrade went to his own lodgings. Holmes was unusually thoughtful. He did not appear troubled by the mystery itself. Rather, he seemed to be arranging the facts in his mind, placing each one beside the others until they formed a complete picture. I asked him how he could be so certain about the stone. He explained that the absence of blood was not important. The grass beneath it showed that it had been lying there for only a short time. There was no natural reason for the stone to have been moved to that position. Its size and shape were also suitable for the injuries. More importantly, it had been found close to the path of the unknown visitor. Holmes then returned to the footprints. The stranger had walked in a peculiar manner. The impression of one foot was weaker than the other. This suggested that he had placed less weight upon his right leg. He had been lame. His stride also gave an indication of his height. The unusual boots had left clear impressions in the soft ground. The manner in which the stranger had approached the tree was also revealing. At one point he had walked upon his toes, perhaps because he wished to move quietly. But the most interesting evidence had been found beneath the beech tree. Holmes had discovered cigar ash. He had long studied tobacco ashes and could distinguish one kind from another. The ash beneath the tree belonged to an Indian cigar. The discovery meant that the stranger had remained there for some time. He had not simply passed through the wood. He had been waiting. Holmes believed that the stranger had stood behind the tree while Charles McCarthy and his son quarreled. From that hidden position, the stranger had watched them. The situation became clearer. McCarthy had gone to the pool to meet someone. That person had been nearby. He had waited while McCarthy spoke with his son. Then, when the opportunity came, he had attacked. The unknown man had not needed to approach the victim openly. He had already been close enough. The question of the gray cloth now became important. James had remembered seeing something gray near the body. If his memory was accurate, the murderer had been wearing a gray cloak. The cloak had apparently been dropped during the attack or escape. The murderer had later returned to collect it. That explained the strange tracks which Holmes had found. The stranger had approached the tree, moved away, and then returned. His movements had seemed puzzling until the cloak was considered. I began to understand how Holmes had reconstructed the crime. Yet one mystery remained. Why had McCarthy called? Coup? Holmes believed that the answer lay in Australia. The word was not an ordinary English call. It was a familiar Australian signal, one that could naturally be used between people who had lived there. Both McCarthy and Turner had spent years in Australia. That meant the unknown visitor was very likely someone with an Australian past. Holmes had therefore reduced the enormous number of possible suspects to a very small group. He then considered the dying man's final word. The young man had heard something that sounded like rat. Holmes did not believe it was meaningless. A man who had suffered a sudden and fatal blow might not have enough strength to pronounce an entire name. If McCarthy had been trying to identify his killer, he might have spoken only part of the name. Holmes had already thought of a place in Australia, Ballarat. It was a mining town in Victoria, famous during the gold rush. If McCarthy had tried to say the name of someone connected with Ballarat, his final words might easily have been misunderstood. The more Holmes considered the clues, the more they pointed in one direction. An Australian, a man connected with Ballarat, a man familiar with the countryside, a tall man, a left-handed man, a man who limped, a man wearing thick-soled shooting boots and a gray cloak, a smoker of Indian cigars, a man who used a cigar holder, and a man who carried blunt penknife. It seemed almost impossible that such a person could remain hidden for long. Holmes, however, was not yet ready to make an accusation. He had reached a conclusion. He now needed confirmation. After lunch, Holmes told me that he expected to return to London that evening. This surprised me. The mystery appeared to have reached a strange stage. Holmes claimed that it was solved, yet the murderer had not been arrested. Lestrade had not accepted his theory. The police still believed James McCarthy was responsible. Holmes had no official authority to arrest anyone. He could only uncover the truth and provide evidence strong enough to save an innocent man. I asked whether he intended to leave the matter unfinished. He looked at me with quiet confidence. To him, the case was finished. Only the final part remained. That afternoon, Holmes and I sat together in the hotel. The sunlight entered through the windows, and the ordinary sounds of Ross continued outside. There was something almost peaceful about the room. Yet the facts we were discussing were grim. Holmes began to examine the case from the beginning. He told me that two details in James McCarthy's account had immediately attracted his attention. The first was the cry of cooey. The second was the dying reference to the supposed rat. Both appeared strange, but Holmes believed that strange facts were often the most valuable. He had decided to assume that James's account was true. This was a method I had seen him use many times. Rather than beginning with the police theory, Holmes had taken the young man's statement as his starting point and asked what must be true if the statement were accurate. If James had really left his father alive, then someone else had killed him. If James had truly heard the cry after walking away, then McCarthy had called to someone. And if McCarthy had called to someone, that person had probably been the reason for his journey to the pool. Holmes then considered the Australian connection. McCarthy had lived in Australia. Turner had lived there too. Both men had returned to England and established themselves in the West Country. Their shared history was therefore more than a simple coincidence. Something from their Australian years seemed to be reaching across the years and to the present. At that moment, I did not know how important that thought would become. Holmes reached into his pocket and produced a folded map. It was a map of Victoria. He had obtained it after his visit to the prison. He unfolded it carefully upon the table. The map showed the mining districts and settlements of the colony. Holmes pointed toward Ballarat. The dying word began to make sense. What James had heard as a reference to a rat could have been the final part of the name, Ballarat. McCarthy might have been trying to identify the murderer. The word had not been a meaningless utterance. It had been a fragment of a name. This discovery narrowed the mystery considerably. The murderer was not merely an Australian. He was connected with Ballarat. The gray cloak provided another clue. James had remembered seeing something gray near the body. If that memory was correct, then the unknown man had worn such a garment. Holmes now had a clearer picture. He had been able to follow the stranger's tracks from the pool to the great beech tree and beyond. He had studied the stride. He had studied the boots. He had noticed the uneven pressure between the feet. He had examined the ground where the man had waited. He had found cigar ash, and he had identified the type of cigar. All of these small details had formed one picture. Holmes explained that observation was nothing without inference. Anyone could see a footprint. Few people would ask what the footprint meant. A difference in pressure might reveal a limp. The length of a stride might suggest height. The shape of a sole could reveal the type of boot. Ash could reveal the smoker. Even the way cigar had been cut could tell something about the object used to cut it. Holmes had examined the cigar remains closely. The cigar had been smoked through a holder. The end had not been bitten. It had been cut. But the cut was rough rather than clean. Holmes therefore believed the smoker had used a blunt penknife. Every detail was becoming another thread in the net. I could now see why Holmes had been so confident. There was one matter that troubled me. The man described by Holmes was not an unknown wanderer. He had to be someone who belonged in the neighborhood. The pool lay between the Hatherley property and the Turner estate. Stranger could hardly have approached and escaped without difficulty. Someone familiar with the land would have known the paths through the woods. Someone connected with the families would have had reason to be there. Holmes had not yet said the name aloud, but I had begun to suspect that the answer might be closer than I had imagined. Then came an interruption. The hotel waiter entered our room. He announced that a gentleman wished to see Sherlock Holmes. Holmes looked toward the door. The visitor entered. He was an old man of remarkable appearance. His shoulders were bent, and he walked slowly with a limp. His frame was large and powerful, despite the weakness that had overtaken him. His face was deeply lined. His hair and beard were gray, and his eyebrows hung heavily over his eyes. Yet there was something else about him. His face was almost unnaturally pale. His lips carried a bluish shade. To my medical eye, it was immediately clear that the man was seriously ill. Holmes invited him to sit. The visitor was John Turner. He had come quietly because he did not wish his visit to attract attention. His expression told me that he already understood what Holmes knew. The old man's eyes were filled with exhaustion. He seemed to have carried some terrible burden for many years. Holmes did not need to accuse him. Instead, he spoke calmly of Charles McCarthy. Turner lowered his face into his hands. The truth had reached him. Before the words were spoken, he admitted that he had killed McCarthy, but he insisted that he had never intended for James to suffer for the crime. If the young man were going to be condemned, Turner would have confessed. The old man's illness made his position even more tragic. He was already close to death. He feared prison, but he feared something else more deeply, his daughter. He then proposed a solution. Turner would write down the truth and sign it. I would witness the statement. Holmes would keep it safely and use it only if James McCarthy were in danger of being convicted. The old man agreed. He had carried his secret for 20 years. Now, at last, he was ready to explain. The story he told us began far from the peaceful fields of Herefordshire. It began in Australia, during the days of the gold fields. And as I listened to John Turner's account, I realized that the murder at Boscombe Pool was not the beginning of the tragedy. It was the final consequence of a much older crime. Little did I know that the peaceful country house before us had been built upon a secret that had survived for 2 decades. John Turner sat quietly before us, his hands resting upon the arms of the chair. The effort of coming to the hotel had clearly exhausted him. His breathing was heavy, and from time to time he closed his eyes as though the memories he was about to describe were almost too painful to recall. Holmes remained silent. This was one of the qualities I had always admired in him. When a man had finally reached the point where he was prepared to reveal a secret, Holmes did not hurry him. He allowed silence to do its work. Turner began his story with the Australian goldfields. Many years earlier, he had traveled to Australia as a young man. The country was very different from the quiet English countryside in which he had eventually settled. The gold fields were rough and lawless places where men came from every corner of the world in search of fortune. Among those men was Charles McCarthy. Turner and McCarthy had become partners. At first, a relationship had been an ordinary friendship between 2 men trying to make their way in a difficult country. They worked together, shared the hardships of the gold fields, and gradually became successful. But there was another side to their lives. The men had become involved with a group of criminals. Turner spoke of them with obvious shame. They were not ordinary thieves. They were men who had learned to take what they wanted by force and who regarded violence as an ordinary part of life. Turner had eventually decided to leave that world behind. McCarthy had not. The 2 men separated. Turner went his own way and eventually made a fortune. He later returned to England and established himself as a respectable landowner. McCarthy also came to England, but the past had not forgotten either man. Turner paused for several moments before continuing. There had been a robbery in Australia. The details were terrible, and even after all those years, he struggled to describe them. A coach had been attacked. Men had been killed. Money had been taken. Turner had been involved. McCarthy had been involved. And Turner believed that one day their past might destroy everything he had built. The man sitting before us was no longer merely the wealthy neighbor whom I had known through the earlier reports. He was a man who had spent years trying to bury the memory of his youth. His wealth, his house, his position in the county, and the respect of his neighbors had all been built after he had escaped a life he once led. He had changed his name and begun again. Yet Charles McCarthy knew the truth. That was the heart of the tragedy. McCarthy had never forgotten what Turner had done. Over the years, he had reminded Turner that he knew his secret. At first, Turner had been willing to help him. He gave McCarthy money. He gave him a farm. He protected him from financial difficulties. He hoped that kindness would keep the past buried. But McCarthy wanted more. He wanted his son James to marry Alice Turner. This was the point at which the old secret became a threat to the younger generation. Turner could not bear the thought. Alice knew nothing of her father's earlier life. To her, he was simply her father. a respected and wealthy man. James knew nothing either. McCarthy knew everything. He could reveal the truth at any time. The marriage would have united the two families, but Turner feared that it would also bring the old crime into the light. He had therefore opposed the marriage. McCarthy became angry. The disagreement between the two men grew stronger. Turner told us that McCarthy had become increasingly demanding. The more Turner gave, the more McCarthy expected. It was no longer simply a matter of helping an old friend. Turner felt that he was being controlled by a man who possessed the power to destroy him. Holmes listened without interruption. I could see that the old man's confession was also an explanation for many of the facts we had already encountered. The friendship between Turner and McCarthy had never been entirely what it appeared. The financial support given to Hatherley Farm had not simply been an act of generosity. There had been fear behind it. Turner continued. On the day of the murder, McCarthy had arranged to meet him at Boscombe Pool. The Australian call had been used because it was a signal familiar to both men. Turner had gone there secretly. He had followed McCarthy through the woods and waited near the beech tree. He had brought his gray cloak. He had his shooting boots. He had smoked while waiting. The physical evidence Holmes had discovered had therefore been correct. Turner had been there. He had watched McCarthy speak with his son. He had heard their quarrel. He had seen James leave. Then he had approached McCarthy. The conversation between the two old men had quickly become bitter. McCarthy had again threatened him. He had spoken of Alice. He had spoken of that, and finally, Turner had lost control. He had struck McCarthy with the stone. Once, then again, the older man had fallen. The murder had been committed. Turner stopped speaking. For several moments, the room was silent. Outside, the sound of a carriage passing along the street seemed strangely distant. I had heard many confessions during my years as a doctor and later as Holmes's companion, but this one affected me deeply. Turner had not killed from sudden greed, nor had he done so because McCarthy had attacked him. He had killed because he believed that the life he had spent decades building was about to lapse. It did not excuse the act, but it explained the fear behind it. Holmes asked him what had happened afterward. Turner explained that he had hidden himself among the trees. He had seen James return to his father. The young man's arrival had caused him great alarm. For a moment, Turner had considered revealing himself, but he had been too frightened. He had taken the path through the wood and escaped toward the road. James had found his father dying. The gray object he had remembered was part of Turner's clothing. The tracks had revealed the rest. Holmes' deductions had been almost exact. There was still one matter. Turner had not expected James to be arrested. He believed that the young man would simply report the murder and that the police would eventually discover that another person had been present. Instead, the circumstances had turned against James. The gun, the quarrel, the blood, the missing hat, the young man's strange behavior, each fact had been interpreted in the worst possible way. Turner had watched from a distance while an innocent man was accused of killing his own father. That was why he had come to Holmes. He could not allow James to die for a crime he had committed. Yet there was another reason. He was dying. His heart was failing. His illness had become severe. After McCarthy's death, he knew that he had little time. If he remained silent, the truth would die with him. But if he confessed openly, Alice would learn that the father she loved had once been involved in terrible crimes. Holmes therefore offered the old man a way to protect his daughter while saving James. Turner would write the entire truth. The document would remain with Holmes. If James were convicted, Holmes would produce it. If James were acquitted and no accusation remained against him, Holmes would keep the confession private. Turner accepted. He asked for paper. I placed a sheet before him. His hand trembled as he began to write. The room remained silent, except for the scratching of his pen. I remember watching him closely. There was something tragic about his appearance. He was a wealthy and respected man, yet at that moment he seemed very old. The years of secrecy had taken their price. His confession did not merely describe one murder. It described an entire life spent running from the consequences of earlier actions. When he finished, he signed the statement. Holmes read it carefully. He then folded the pages and placed them inside his coat. The immediate danger to James had been removed. Yet Holmes was not satisfied with simply proving the young man's innocence. He wished to understand every part of the case. He returned to the strange circumstances surrounding murder. Why had James's hand been covered with blood? The answer was simple. He had touched his father's wound. Why had his gun been found near the body? Because he had carried it while walking through the countryside. Why had he been seen quarreling with his father? Because his father had been pressuring him about Alice. Why had he appeared so disturbed? Because he had just discovered his father dying. Each apparently incriminating fact had an innocent explanation. The police had simply interpreted all of them in the same direction. Holmes had done the opposite. He had considered each fact independently. That was the essential difference. He did not ask whether the evidence could prove James guilty. He asked whether the evidence was consistent with innocence. Once that question was asked, the case changed completely. The physical evidence then became especially important. The footprints showed that another man had been present. The stranger's movement through the woodland showed that he had approached and escaped. The cigar ash indicated that he had waited near the tree. The gray cloth explained James's memory. The stone explained the injuries. The limp, the boots, and the other details helped identify the murderer. The Australian connection explained why McCarthy had called cool. And the dying man's final words pointed toward the old history of the gold fields. Every clue had a place. Nothing needed to be forced. Holmes's greatest satisfaction, I think, came from that harmony between the facts. He was not interested merely in discovering who had committed a crime. He wished to know precisely how the crime had happened. I had sometimes teased him about this habit. To Holmes, however, the difference between knowing and proving was enormous. A suspicion was worthless unless it could be supported. A theory was only useful if every important fact fitted it. In the Boscombe Valley case, the footprints had provided that support. Holmes had not guessed that Turner was the murderer simply because Turner had a motive. He had discovered that the unknown man at the pool, physical characteristics matching Turner, and once Turner had confessed, every remaining detail fell into place. There was still the matter of James's secret marriage. That secret had almost destroyed him. His father had believed that James's refusal to marry Alice showed that he did not love her. In reality, James had been protecting her from embarrassment and pain. His secret marriage had made him appear suspicious when he was actually trying to prevent harm to the woman he loved. The entire tragedy was therefore filled with misunderstandings. Charles McCarthy had misunderstood his son's motives. The police had misunderstood James's behavior. James had misunderstood the reason for his father's strange meeting. And Turner had spent years believing that silence could protect his daughter. Holmes, by contrast, had simply followed the facts. That was why he had succeeded. Later that afternoon, Holmes and I prepared to leave Ross. Before we departed, however, there remained one final matter. James McCarthy had to be released. Holmes arranged for the written confession to be made available to the authorities. Once they had examined it, there could be no reasonable case against James. The young man was freed. The news brought great relief to Alice Turner. She had believed in his innocence from the beginning, yet she had not known how close he had come to losing his life. Holmes did not seek praise. He rarely did. He considered the case another problem that had been placed before him, solved. For me, it was something more. I had watched an innocent young man come within sight of ruin because several ordinary facts had been arranged into a false story. I had also seen how a man could carry a secret for 20 years and still be unable to escape it. The old Australian crime had followed Turner across the world. He had changed his surroundings. He had accumulated wealth. He had built a respectable life, but he had never truly left the past behind. And so the Boscombe Valley Mystery came to its conclusion. At the time, I did not know that I would remember the case for so many years. Perhaps it was because of the quiet countryside. Perhaps it was because of the strange footprints beneath the trees. Or perhaps was because Holmes had once again shown me that the truth is often hidden not in the great events, but in the smallest details that ordinary eyes pass over. As our carriage carried us away from Ross, the fields stretched peacefully beneath the evening sky. The tragedy at Boscombe Pool was over, but the memory of it remained with me. And I would often think of the old beech tree standing quietly among the woods, while the secret of 2 decades had finally come to light. The strangest part of the mystery was still ahead, for there was one final reflection I had yet to understand about Holmes's method and the curious chain of events that had brought us there. The road from Ross was quiet as Holmes and I traveled back toward the railway station. Evening had settled over the countryside, and the last light rested gently upon the fields. The hedges were dark against the fading sky, and here and there a thin mist had begun to gather above the low ground. For some time, neither of us spoke. The case had been solved, yet I found myself thinking about the strange path by which we had reached the truth. When we first heard of Charles McCarthy's death, the facts seemed simple. A father had been found murdered beside a pool. His son had been seen arguing with him. The son had carried a gun. Blood had been found upon his clothing. It was easy to believe that the young man was guilty. Indeed, almost every person connected with the investigation had believed it. Yet Holmes had refused to accept that conclusion. He begun with a question that appeared very small. Why had McCarthy called cooey? That single word had opened the door to the past. I had often observed that Holmes did not necessarily begin with the most dramatic fact in a case. He preferred the fact that seemed least important to everyone else. The cry at Boscombe Pool had been dismissed as an ordinary sound. To Holmes, it was a sign. It suggested Australia. Australia connected McCarthy with Turner. Turner connected the present murder with an old life that had apparently been buried many years before. And once Holmes understood that connection, the other clues began to take their proper places. The footprints had been particularly remarkable. I had seen the ground myself. Had I walked through the wood alone, I would have noticed nothing more than the ordinary marks left by people who had passed that way. Holmes had seen a man. He had seen the man's height and the length of his stride. He had seen the weakness of his right leg and the unequal pressure of his feet. He had recognized the boots. He had followed the trail to the beech tree. There, he had discovered the evidence of the man's waiting place. Even the cigar ash had spoken. I had often joked with Holmes about his knowledge of tobacco. He could distinguish ashes with an enthusiasm that I sometimes found excessive. But cases such as this had taught me that his apparently useless knowledge was rarely useless. The ash beneath the tree was not merely ash. It belonged to a particular kind of cigar. The way it had been smoked suggested a particular habit. The use of a cigar holder added another detail. The blunt cut suggested the penknife. One fact after another had quietly described a man whom Holmes had not yet seen. It was only later that I understood the full beauty of the method. Holmes had not been searching for evidence that would support a conclusion he had already chosen. He had allowed the evidence to create the conclusion. That distinction was essential. The police had begun with James McCarthy as their suspect. Every fact was then interpreted against him. Holmes had begun without a suspect. He had examined the facts and asked what they could tell him. The difference was enough to save a young man's life. As we approached the station, I thought about James. He had been placed in a terrible position. His father had pressed him to marry Alice Turner. James could not explain why he refused. The truth was that he had already married another woman in Bristol. He had been ashamed of the secret and feared what it would do to Alice. His silence had therefore looked suspicious. His distress had looked like guilt. His blood-stained hand had appeared damning. Yet every one of these facts had another explanation. James had touched his dying father. He had been distressed because his father was dying. He had argued with him because he was being pressed into a marriage he could not enter. His gun had been with him because he had gone out with it. Nothing was quite what it first appeared. The young man had been fortunate that Holmes had been called, but Holmes himself would never have described it as fortune. To him, it was simply a matter of observation and reasoning. The railway station came into view. The lamps were already glowing, casting small pools of yellow light upon the platform. A few passengers waited quietly, while porters moved about their work. Holmes bought our tickets. As we waited for the train, I asked him whether he believed Turner had been entirely truthful. Holmes looked at me with a faint smile. He said that the confession was consistent with the evidence. That was enough. He had no need to embellish it. The old man's story explained the Australian connection, the meeting at the pool, the call of Cooey, the footprints, the grey cloak, the cigar ash, and the weapon. It also explained why Turner had remained silent for so long. His entire life in England had been an attempt to escape the consequences of his earlier life. He had become a respectable man. He had acquired wealth. He had raised a daughter. He had earned the confidence of those around him. Yet Charles McCarthy had known the truth, and that knowledge had given McCarthy power over him. The tragedy was that Turner had not been able to escape his own conscience either. The murder had not ended his fear. It had made it worse. His daughter Alice had been near the center of his thoughts. Throughout the whole affair, he feared not only punishment, but the destruction of the image she held of him. In this respect, the case was very different from many of our London adventures. There had been no elaborate criminal organization, no secret society, no clever disguise, no complicated mechanism. Instead, there had been two old men carrying the weight of their past into their later lives. One had used that past to gain influence. The other had tried desperately to hide it. The result had been tragedy. The train arrived with a long hiss of steam. Holmes and I entered our carriage. Once we were seated, I watched the countryside move slowly past. The houses became fewer, the fields grew darker, the lamps of distant villages appeared one by one. Holmes settled himself into his corner and closed his eyes. He seemed completely at peace. I knew that he would soon be thinking about another problem. That was Holmes. One mystery could occupy every part of his mind for days, but once the truth had been established, he could leave it behind with remarkable ease. I, however, was not so fortunate. I continued to think about Boscombe Valley. Perhaps it was because I had seen James McCarthy in prison. Perhaps it was because I had watched John Turner confess. Or perhaps was simply because the case demonstrated one of Holmes's greatest principles so clearly: a fact must be examined before it can be judged. This lesson had appeared again and again during our years together. A footprint could be a footprint, or it could be a man's biography. A piece of ash could be nothing, or could place suspect beneath a tree at the precise time of a murder. A strange word from a dying man could seem meaningless, or it could be the broken fragment of a name. A young man's silence could look like guilt, or it could be shame, fear, or love. The truth depended upon understanding the circumstances. Holmes had always possessed the patience to look beyond the first explanation. That was why his successes often appeared miraculous to those who knew only the final result. They did not see the hours of careful observation that came before it. They did not see him kneeling beside a footprint. They did not see him studying ash. They did not see him comparing the marks upon the ground. They saw only the final answer. I had the privilege of seeing the process, and I never ceased to find it remarkable. The train carried us farther from Boscombe Valley. I began to think about the great beech tree. It stood in my memory as clearly as if I had seen it that morning. Beneath its branches, Turner had waited. He had watched McCarthy and James. He had smoked his cigar. He had carried the stone. And afterward, his footprints had remained behind to tell the story he wished to conceal. Nature had been a silent witness. The earth itself had preserved the evidence. Turner had believed that he had escaped. He had forgotten that a man might hide his actions from other people without hiding them from the ground beneath his feet. Holmes had understood this immediately. That was perhaps the most striking part of the case. The murderer had not been defeated by a confession alone. He had been defeated by the traces he had left behind. Little did I know, when I first accompanied Holmes into that quiet Herefordshire countryside, that a handful of footprints would speak more clearly than all the testimony gathered at the inquest. As the darkness deepened, Holmes opened his eyes. He looked out of the window. For a moment, the familiar half-smile appeared upon his face. He remarked that country investigations had one great advantage over London cases. The ground was usually more honest. I smiled at the remark. It was very like Holmes. He could turn even a grim murder into a quiet observation about the habits of nature. Soon afterward, he returned to his thoughts. I leaned back and allowed the rhythm of the train to carry me into a quieter state. The events of the past few days seemed already to be fading into memory, yet the case remained with me. I remembered Alice Turner most of all. She had believed in James when almost everyone else doubted him. Her faith had never depended upon evidence. It had simply been the faith of someone who knew the character of the person she loved. In the end, that faith had been justified. James was free. His father's murderer had confessed, and the terrible suspicion that had fallen upon him had been removed. The tragedy could not be undone. Charles McCarthy was dead. John Turner would carry the burden of his actions to the end of his life, but an innocent young man had been spared. For that, I was grateful. There are cases in which Holmes's victory feels almost cheerful. The Boscombe Valley Mystery was not one of them. It left behind too many shadows. The old partnership, the fear of exposure, the quarrel beside the pool, the stone beneath the beech tree, and the young man who nearly lost everything because the truth was hidden beneath appearances. Still, there was comfort in knowing that the truth had finally been uncovered. That perhaps was one of the reasons I remembered the case so clearly. Holmes had once told me that the world was full of obvious things which nobody ever observed. I had heard the sentence before, but after Boscombe Valley, I understood it more deeply. The world around us is filled with small signs. Most pass unnoticed. A mark in the earth, a little ash, a broken twig, a word spoken at the wrong moment, a hesitation, a silence. Individually, they may appear worthless. Together, they can tell an entire story, and that was the lesson I carried away from the case. Sherlock Holmes did not possess some supernatural gift. He possessed something more useful. He looked, he remembered, he compared, and above all, he refused to allow an attractive explanation to become the truth merely because it was convenient. Years have passed since that journey. Many details of my life with Holmes have become softened by time. Yet I can still picture the quiet country road. I can still remember the trees around Boscombe Pool. I can still see Holmes bending over the earth, examining the marks left by a man who believed himself hidden. And I can still remember the peaceful sound of the train carrying us back toward London. Perhaps that is why this particular adventure has remained among my most memorable recollections. It was not merely a story of murder. It was a story of appearances and reality, of a young man who looked guilty but was innocent, of an old man who looked respectable but carried a terrible secret, and of a detective who understood that the truth might be found in places where nobody else thought to look. The train continued through the night. Holmes had fallen asleep. The mystery was finished. The innocent had been freed. The truth had been written down. And the old secrets of Australia had finally come to rest. I closed my eyes and allowed the steady movement of the train to quiet my thoughts. Another case had ended. Another strange chapter of my life with Sherlock Holmes had passed into memory. And even now, after so many years, I remain grateful that I was there to witness the extraordinary way in which a few simple clues brought justice to an innocent man. Until we meet again, my dear friend, good night. Although our journey from Ross had taken us away from the immediate scene of the crime, the affair was not yet entirely finished in my mind. There are mysteries which end when the criminal is discovered. Others continue to occupy the thoughts long after the practical work has been completed. The Boscombe Valley case belonged to the latter kind. Had Holmes accepted the first appearance of the evidence, the young man might have been condemned for a crime he had never committed. It was a sobering thought. Holmes, however, seemed unconcerned. He had opened his newspaper and was reading it with the same attention he might have given to any ordinary evening. The transition always surprised me. When a case was unsolved, Holmes could devote every part of his mind to it. He would examine the smallest detail, return repeatedly to an apparently insignificant fact, and refuse to rest until the whole pattern had become clear. But once the mystery had been explained, he could turn away from it almost immediately. I asked him whether he thought James and Alice would eventually marry. Holmes lowered the newspaper. He smiled slightly. He reminded me that human affairs are far less predictable than footprints. I could not disagree. The young couple had been placed under an extraordinary strain. James had already concealed a previous marriage, while Alice had been caught between her father's wishes and her affection for James. Whether their relationship would survive everything that had happened was not something even Sherlock Holmes could deduce from physical evidence. That amused me. For all his extraordinary powers of observation, Holmes had never claimed to understand every movement of the human heart. Perhaps that was why I valued his friendship. He could examine the smallest mark upon the ground yet he knew that some questions were better left to time. The train moved steadily through the night. From time to time, a distant light appeared beyond the window and then vanished behind us. I thought once more of Charles McCarthy. His death had been caused by a secret which had begun long before the day at Boscombe Pool. That was perhaps the most disturbing feature of the case. The murder itself had taken only moments. The circumstances that produced it had taken decades. A friendship formed in Australia, a crime committed during the turbulent days of the goldfields, a fortune made afterward, a respectable English life, a daughter who knew nothing of her father's past, former companion who knew everything, and finally, a meeting beside a quiet country pool. The past had not disappeared. It simply waited. I had often noticed that Holmes disliked explanations which depended upon coincidence. He preferred a chain of events in which each fact led naturally to the next. The Boscombe Valley Mystery possessed such a chain. McCarthy had known Turner in Australia. Turner had feared McCarthy because of their shared past. McCarthy had used that knowledge to maintain influence over him. Turner had attempted to resist. The disagreement had grown. On the afternoon of the tragedy, McCarthy had gone to Boscombe Pool. Turner followed. James arrived unexpectedly. The father and son quarreled. James left. Turner remained. Then the fatal blow was struck. Nothing supernatural had occurred. Nothing mysterious in the ordinary sense. The mystery had existed because nobody had known the history connecting the people involved. Once that history was uncovered, the events became understandable. Holmes had once told me that a detective must sometimes know something of everything. In our adventures, I had seen him use knowledge of chemistry, anatomy, literature, music, tobacco, footprints, handwriting, geography, and countless other subjects. But there was another form of knowledge which seemed equally important. He understood human weakness. He knew that fear could make a man behave strangely. He knew that shame could make an innocent person conceal facts. He knew that grief could produce confusion. And he knew that a guilty man might sometimes behave exactly as an innocent man would behave. This was particularly important in James's case. The young man's silence had looked suspicious. Yet Holmes understood that James had a private reason for refusing to discuss the true subject of his argument with his father. The secret marriage was painful enough. To reveal it publicly would have exposed the woman he loved to embarrassment. So he remained silent. The police interpreted that silence as evidence of guilt. Holmes interpreted it as a question. That was the difference. A lesser investigator might have said, "He refuses to explain himself, therefore he must be hiding his guilt." Holmes asked, what other reason could cause him to remain silent? Once he had found another reasonable explanation, the supposed evidence lost much of its strength. The same principle applied to the blood on James's hand. It looked terrible, but Holmes asked how the blood had reached the hand. The answer was simple. James had tried to help his dying father. The fact was genuine. The interpretation had been wrong. This distinction between fact and interpretation was, I believe, one of the greatest lessons I learned from Holmes. Facts do not always speak for themselves. People make them speak. And if a person begins with the wrong conclusion, even perfectly accurate facts may be arranged into a false story. I thought of Lestrade. He was an excellent officer, and I had great respect for him. But he often preferred a neat answer. Holmes preferred a true answer. The two were not always the same. Lestrade had seen a young man with a gun, a quarrel, blood, and a dead father. He had built his case. Holmes had seen the same things and asked what they did not prove. That question had changed everything. The train slowed as we approached another station. A few passengers entered the carriage. Porter walked along the platform carrying a lantern. Then the train moved onward. Holmes had returned to his newspaper. I wondered whether he had already forgotten the entire matter, but after some time he folded the paper and looked toward me. He said that one part of the investigation had interested him more than the confession. Naturally, I asked which part. He answered that it was the footprint evidence. He had been particularly impressed by the way the ground had preserved the movements of the unknown man. I smiled. Holmes had always possessed a fascination for such things. He explained that a footprint was rarely just an outline of a shoe. The ground recorded pressure, pressure recorded movement, movement recorded physical condition, and physical condition could become identity. The stranger's limp had therefore been visible before Holmes knew who the stranger was. The difference between the impressions of the 2 feet had revealed that one leg was weaker. The stride had suggested his height. The boots had suggested his habits. The manner in which he had moved through the woodlands suggested caution. The cigar ash revealed where he had waited. The gray cloth gave another link to the witness's memory. All these clues had existed before Holmes had spoken to Turner. That was why the confession mattered. It confirmed a conclusion already supported by independent evidence. Holmes never liked relying upon a single clue. One clue might mislead. Several unrelated clues pointing toward the same person were another matter. That was the foundation of his reasoning. I thought of the stone. It had looked so insignificant, yet it had been the instrument of death. A man might conceal a weapon. He might throw it away. He might attempt to wipe it clean. But in this case, the murderer used something lying naturally within reach. There was no dramatic weapon to identify, only an ordinary stone. That simplicity had helped conceal the truth. Holmes had understood that the weapon did not need to be remarkable. It only needed to fit the injuries in its circumstances. Again, the small fact had proved more useful than the obvious one. Outside the carriage window, the night was almost complete. The reflection of the lamps peered faintly upon the glass. I leaned back and allowed my thoughts to wander. The image of Boscombe Pool returned to me. I remembered the still water, the surrounding trees, the quiet paths. It was difficult to imagine that such a peaceful place had witnessed a murder. But perhaps that was another lesson of the case. Violence does not require a violent setting. A crime can occur in a dark London alley. It can occur in a crowded street. Or it can occur beside a quiet pool in the countryside on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. The surroundings do not tell us what happened. The evidence does. Holmes had always been careful about such distinctions. He never allowed atmosphere to replace observation. That was one reason I had included so much atmosphere in my own writings about our adventures. London fog, gas lamps, rain upon the windows, the glow of the Baker Street fire, these things formed the setting of our lives. But Holmes knew that a foggy street was not evidence of a crime. A footprint was. The difference might seem obvious, yet in practice, people constantly confused the two. We prefer stories. We like to imagine that a sinister place must contain a sinister secret. But truth is often quieter, a small mark, a missing object, an unexplained word, a person's hesitation. These are the things that matter. The Boscombe Valley case had reminded me of that. By the time we reached London, Holmes was already thinking about another matter. The great city greeted us with its familiar sounds. Carriages moved through the streets. Gas lamps illuminated the pavements. The air carried the mixture of smoke and dampness that I had come to associate with London. We made our way toward Baker Street. When we entered our old rooms, the familiar surroundings gave me a feeling of comfort. The fire had been left prepared. Holmes removed his coat and placed his traveling things aside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I looked toward the familiar chair where Holmes had spent so many hours examining evidence. The room seemed almost unchanged. And yet, I knew that another strange case had now joined the many memories connected with it. Holmes lit his pipe. The soft smoke rose toward the ceiling. I sat near the fire. The quiet was pleasant. After the long journey, I felt tired. Holmes, however, appeared completely refreshed. He remarked that the case had demonstrated an important principle. When a crime seems obvious, one should be especially careful. The mind naturally seeks a simple explanation. Once it finds one, it begins rejecting anything that contradicts it. Holmes regarded this as one of the greatest dangers in investigation. He called it allowing the theory to control the evidence. The correct method, he believed, was the reverse. Evidence must control the theory. I had heard him say similar things before. Boscombe Valley provided a particularly clear example. James had looked guilty. That appearance had almost destroyed him. Turner had looked respectable. That appearance had protected him. Yet neither appearance had been the truth. The young man was innocent. The respectable old landowner was a murderer. Holmes had looked beneath both appearances. Perhaps that was why I remember the case with such affection, despite its sadness. It was a quiet victory. There had been no dramatic pursuit through the streets, no struggle with a dangerous criminal, no elaborate trap. Instead, Holmes had simply walked through the countryside and read what the earth had preserved. He had listened to a dying man's broken word. He had considered an Australian expression. He had noticed a cigar ash. He had followed a trail, and gradually the hidden story had appeared. If I were to describe Holmes's genius in a single image from that case, it would not be his final confrontation with Turner. It would be Holmes kneeling beneath the beech tree. The rest of us had seen leaves, earth, and shadows. He had seen a man. He had seen where that man had stood. He had seen where he had walked. He had seen the evidence of his habits. And from those small traces, he had reconstructed an event that nobody else had witnessed. That was Sherlock Holmes. The next morning, the newspapers carried the news that James McCarthy had been cleared. The public interest in the case began to fade. For most people, it was simply another country murder that had been solved. For me, it was something more personal. I knew how close the young man had come to losing his freedom. I knew how easily the first interpretation of the evidence could have become accepted as fact, and I knew that without Holmes's intervention, the real story might never have been discovered. I also thought about John Turner. His confession had prevented one injustice, but it could not erase the other consequences of his life. Charles McCarthy was dead. His own daughter now stood close to a truth that Turner had spent years trying to hide. The past had finally reached the present. There are some debts which cannot be paid with money. There are some secrets which cannot be kept forever. And there are some mistakes which no confession can completely undo. Yet perhaps confession itself can be a form of courage. Turner had finally accepted responsibility. He could have remained silent. He was already seriously ill. He might have allowed James to carry the blame. Instead, when the young man's life was threatened, he came forward. That did not make his crime less terrible, but it prevented another injustice. Holmes understood this. He never excused murder. But he also understood that human beings were more complicated than the labels placed upon them. A murderer could still love his daughter. An innocent man could still behave suspiciously. A respectable gentleman could still carry a terrible secret, and a detective could uncover the truth without pretending that the truth was simple. That evening, I returned to my own home. The events of Boscombe Valley were beginning to settle into memory, yet before I went to sleep, I found myself thinking once more of that peaceful pool. The water would continue to reflect the sky. The trees would continue to move gently in the wind. Birds would return to the branches. Travelers would pass along the roads. Life would continue. Places do not remember tragedies in the way people do, but I remembered, and perhaps that is why, years later, I found myself recording the story. Not simply because Sherlock Holmes had solved another mystery, but because the case had demonstrated, in a particularly clear way, the value of patience. The truth had not announced itself. It had waited quietly. It had been present in the earth, in the ash, in the footprints, in the strange Australian call, in the fragment of a dying man's final word. Holmes had simply been willing to listen. At that time, I could not yet understand how many other cases would teach me the same lesson in different forms. But I had already learned enough to know that whenever Holmes became interested in some tiny detail that everyone else considered unimportant, I would do well to pay attention. For the smallest clue might someday become the key to the whole mystery. There is a curious habit which comes with advancing years. The events of one's youth, even those which once seemed vivid and immediate, gradually become softened by time. Faces grow less distinct. Voices fade. The exact dates of journeys and appointments become difficult to place. Yet certain scenes remain remarkably clear. For me, the beech tree at Boscombe Pool is one such scene. I can still picture Holmes standing beneath its branches, his long figure bent over the earth, his attention fixed upon marks which I would scarcely have noticed. I can still remember the quiet countryside around us and the feeling that the whole place had become a page upon which some unseen hand had written the story of the crime. At the time, I did not fully appreciate how unusual that moment was. I had already spent years with Holmes. I had watched him solve mysteries in London, drawing rooms, country houses, railway compartments, and lonely streets. I had seen him examine handwriting, footprints, ashes, clothing, wounds, and countless other small objects. Yet each case taught me something new. Boscombe Valley taught me that a place can preserve a memory, not a memory in the human sense, of course. The earth does not remember. A tree does not remember. A path does not remember. But the traces left behind by human beings can remain there long enough for a patient observer to recover what happened. That was what Holmes had done. He had reconstructed a meeting that no one had properly witnessed. He had discovered that there had been another person at the pool. He had determined the physical condition of that person. He had followed the trail, and eventually he had connected the stranger with a man whose past had seemed completely separate from the murder. The beauty of the solution was its simplicity. Once everything was known, the mystery appeared almost inevitable. Before it was known, however, the facts seemed disconnected. That is often the nature of a mystery. The answer may be simple. Finding it is not. I remember thinking about James McCarthy after his release. The young man had been through an ordeal which I would not wish upon anyone. He had lost his father. He had been arrested. He had been placed under suspicion. And during all this, he had been unable to explain the one secret which might have made his behavior easier to understand. His marriage in Bristol had seemed to him a private shame. He had not wished Alice Turner to know of it, nor had he wished the matter discussed before strangers, so he had kept silent. That silence nearly destroyed him. It was a painful example of how a private secret can become dangerous when circumstances force it into the wrong setting. James had not been prepared for an investigation. He had not known which details mattered. He had not understood that every hesitation might be interpreted as guilt. Holmes understood this immediately. The police wanted a complete account. James could not provide one without exposing himself. The result was suspicion. I sometimes wondered whether James ever fully understood how close he had come to disaster. Perhaps it was better that he did not. Some knowledge is useful. Other knowledge merely leaves a scar. Alice Turner, I thought, had suffered in a different way. She had been placed between two worlds. Her father was the man she had known all her life. James was the man she loved. The conflict between them had been created by secrets belonging to an earlier generation. She had not caused any of it, yet she had been forced to bear its consequences. This was another feature of the case which stayed with me. The actions of one generation often fall upon the next. Turner's crimes in Australia had taken place long before Alice was born. McCarthy's knowledge of those crimes had shaped the lives of their children. The young people had inherited a problem they had never created. And so, in the end, the Boscombe Valley Mystery was not merely a question of who had killed Charles McCarthy. It was also a story about the persistence of the past. Holmes had little interest in moral speeches. He rarely told people what they ought to have done. He preferred to establish what had happened. Yet, I knew him well enough to understand that he recognized the human tragedy in such cases. He could be cold in his manner. He could sometimes appear almost detached. But that was partly because he believed that emotion could interfere with judgment. His compassion was often hidden beneath precision. In the Boscombe Valley case, this was particularly clear. He could have exposed Turner immediately. He could have handed the old man over to the police without hesitation. Instead, he listened to the confession and considered the circumstances carefully. He understood that Turner had committed a terrible crime, but he also understood that an innocent young man was about to suffer for it. His first duty was to prevent that injustice. Everything else came afterward. That was very much in keeping with Holmes's character. He was not a judge. He was an investigator. His task was to discover the truth. What happened after the truth was known belonged to others. I have sometimes been asked whether Holmes ever became tired of mysteries. The answer, as far as I could tell, was no. What tired him was not mystery, but idleness. When no problem was before him, he could become restless and even difficult. But once a question engaged his mind, he became completely absorbed. I remember this especially well during the Boscombe investigation. The countryside held no attraction for him as scenery. He was not there to admire the fields or the trees. He saw them as evidence. The path was evidence. The mud was evidence. The footprints were evidence. The broken vegetation was evidence. Even the cigar ash was evidence. He treated the landscape almost as a witness who could not speak. His task was to translate it. This was perhaps one of the most remarkable things about his method. Most people look at an object and ask what it is. Holmes looked at it and asked what had happened to it. Footprint was not merely a footprint. It had been made by a person. That person had been walking. The person had placed more weight upon one foot. The stride had a particular length. The sole had a particular pattern. The ground had been disturbed at a particular time. Each observation led to another. The final conclusion was therefore not a guess. It was a chain. I often think that this was the secret of Holmes's success. He rarely made one enormous leap. He made many small steps. Each one was supported by what had come before. The appearance of a great deduction was simply the final result of a great number of careful observations. I had the advantage of seeing this process repeatedly. Even so, I was sometimes astonished. At Boscombe Pool, I had looked at the same ground. Holmes had looked more carefully. That was the difference. The case also reminded me of the importance of resisting the first impression. James McCarthy had appeared guilty. John Turner had appeared respectable. Either appearance was enough. The first impression is useful only as a beginning. It must never become the conclusion. This is particularly true when fear or emotion is involved. A frightened man may look guilty. A grieving man may behave strangely. An ashamed man may refuse to answer questions. A respectable man may have a terrible secret. Human beings are not simple enough to be understood from one expression or one action. Holmes knew this. Perhaps that was why he rarely judged people quickly. He judged evidence. People could wait. There was another small detail from the case which I remembered with particular clarity. The Australian cry, coo. It had seemed almost insignificant, yet it was the sound that pointed toward the distant past. Without it, Holmes might have taken longer to understand the relationship between McCarthy and Turner. It was a reminder that language carries history. A word may reveal where a person has lived. A phrase may reveal who his companions have been. An accent may suggest a place. A name may connect one generation to another. The smallest expression can sometimes open a very large door. Holmes knew this instinctively. He had a remarkable memory for such details. The word also helped explain why McCarthy had gone to the pool. He had not wandered there without purpose. He expected someone. That someone was Turner, and Turner had been waiting. The murder, therefore, had not been a sudden encounter between two strangers. It had been a meeting arranged by people whose history stretched back many years. This distinction mattered enormously. The crime had a history before it had a victim. I think this was what made the case so memorable to me. Many murders begin with a sudden moment of anger. This one had been waiting for years. The anger was old. The fear was old. The resentment was old. Only the final act was new. That evening, after returning from the investigation, I wrote some notes about the case. I wanted to preserve the details while they were still fresh. Holmes was already occupied with another matter. He had placed the Boscombe Valley papers aside and moved on. I smiled when I saw him. To me, the case was still vivid. To Holmes, it had become a solved problem, yet I knew that he would remember every detail if I asked him about it years later. His memory was extraordinary. He could recall the smallest observation long after everyone else had forgotten it. I sometimes wondered whether this was because he remembered facts differently from ordinary people. Perhaps he did not store them as isolated pieces of information. He stored relationships. Footprint belonged to a person. The person belonged to a place. The place belonged to a sequence of events. The sequence led to a conclusion. Everything was connected. That was why his memory seemed so precise. He was not merely remembering details. He was remembering the structure formed by those details. This was another lesson I carried from our years together. Knowledge becomes powerful when it is connected. A fact alone may be useless, but a fact connected to another fact may become evidence. Two pieces of evidence may become a pattern may become a theory, and a theory supported by enough independent evidence may become the truth. Holmes had demonstrated this at Boscombe Valley. A case had begun with uncertainty. It had ended with certainty. Between those 2 points lay observation, nothing more mysterious than that. As the years passed, I came to appreciate this increasingly. I had once thought that Holmes's greatest gift was his intelligence. Later, I understood that his patience was just as important. He was willing to remain with a question longer than most people. He was willing to examine the same object repeatedly. He was willing to admit that an attractive theory might be wrong. That last quality was particularly rare. Many people dislike abandoning an idea once they have become attached to it. Holmes had no such attachment. If the evidence disproved his theory, he discarded it. He would rather be correct than appear correct. That was perhaps why I trusted him so completely. Even when I did not understand his reasoning, I knew that he was following something real, and that the end for Boscombe Valley Mystery required no extraordinary invention. The solution had been waiting in the facts. Turner's confession simply confirmed what the physical evidence had already suggested. James was innocent. The stranger at the pool had been real. The past in Australia had mattered. The cry of cooey had been meaningful. The footprints told the truth, and the stone beneath the beech tree had completed the story. When I think of the case now, I do not remember the murder itself. I remember the quiet road, the quiet pool, the quiet woodland, and Holmes moving slowly through it all, listening to evidence that no ordinary ear could hear. There was something almost peaceful about that memory. Perhaps this is because, after all the fear and confusion, the truth had finally brought order. The innocent man was no longer under suspicion. The hidden story had been revealed. And the mystery, which had seemed so complicated at first, had become simple. That is the strange comfort of a solved mystery. Before the answer, every possibility is open. After the answer, the confusion disappears. One sees the path clearly. The Boscombe Valley Mystery had been such a path, and Holmes had followed it from the first small clue to the final confession. As I close this recollection, I find that I return once more to that beech tree. The years have changed many things. The people involved are now part of history. The arguments, fears, and secrets which once seemed so important have faded, but the lesson remains. Look carefully. Do not mistake appearance for truth. And never dismiss a small fact simply because it appears unimportant, for somewhere beneath the ordinary surface of life, the truth may already be waiting. And sometimes, if one is patient enough, even the quiet earth will tell its story. There are some cases which remain in the memory because of the danger involved. Others remain because of the people we meet. And a few remain because they teach us something about the strange relationship between truth and appearances. The Boscombe Valley Mystery belonged to the last of these. Many years have passed since that journey into Herefordshire, yet I can still remember the quiet confidence with which Sherlock Holmes approached the investigation. There was nothing dramatic in his manner when we first arrived. He did not behave like a man searching for a murderer. He behaved like a man searching for an answer. That distinction became more important with every hour that followed. The death of Charles McCarthy had seemed, at first, almost painfully simple. His son had been found near him. The two had quarreled. James had been seen with a gun. Blood had been discovered upon his hand. There was a strong motive in the form of their disagreement. To many people, that was enough. But Holmes had never believed that a collection of suspicious circumstances was the same thing as proof. He had looked beyond the appearance of guilt, and when he did so, the whole case changed. I have often thought about that quality in him. Sherlock Holmes was not necessarily more observant than every person he met. What distinguished him was the discipline with which he used his observations. He did not simply notice things. He asked questions about them. Why was the cry "cooey" used? Why had McCarthy gone to the pool? Why had James refused to explain his quarrel? Why did the physical injuries suggest an attack from behind? Why were there additional footprints? Why had someone waited beneath the beech tree? Why was cigar ash present there? Why did the stranger's footprints reveal a limp? One question led naturally to another. Eventually, the entire story emerged. That was the true wonder of the investigation. The answer had not been hidden by some impossible trick. It had been hidden by ordinary people failing to ask the right questions. I believe that this is something which applies far beyond detective work. In ordinary life, we often see only what we expect to see. Once we decide that someone is dishonest, every hesitation becomes suspicious. Once we decide that someone is innocent, every unusual action receives an innocent explanation. We arrange the facts around our beliefs. Holmes did the opposite. He arranged his beliefs around the facts. This was one of the reasons I trusted his judgment. He was perfectly willing to change his mind. If a fact contradicted his theory, the theory had to go. He never tried to make the evidence obey him. He obeyed the evidence. That principle was perhaps more valuable than any individual deduction. I remember the countryside round Boscombe Valley particularly well. It was not a place one would naturally associate with violence. The fields were peaceful. The trees stood quietly. The pool itself had none of the threatening character one might expect from the scene of a murder. There was no darkness to hide behind, no crowded street, no noisy city. Only the ordinary landscape of rural England. Yet beneath that calm surface lay the traces of what had happened, the stone, the footprints, the disturbed earth, the ashes, the broken vegetation. Holmes had understood that the countryside did not need to appear mysterious in order to contain mystery. Perhaps that was why I remember it with such clarity. The case also left a lasting impression upon me because of the old friendship between McCarthy and Turner. It had begun in Australia. There, the two men had shared an earlier life. They had experienced hardship. They had taken part in criminal activity. They had eventually separated, but their connection had never truly ended. Turner had returned to England and built a respectable life. McCarthy had followed him. The two men were no longer young. Their lives appeared completely different, yet the past remained between them. McCarthy knew the secret that Turner wanted forgotten. Turner knew that McCarthy possessed the power to destroy everything he had built. That imbalance had poisoned their relationship. The financial support Turner gave McCarthy could be understood in a new way. It was not simply generosity. There was fear behind it. McCarthy had become dependent upon Turner, but Turner had also become dependent upon McCarthy's silence. Neither man was free. That is perhaps one of the saddest aspects of the story. Both had escaped the Australian goldfields. Neither had escaped what they had done there. Years passed. The old crime became more distant, but distance did not make it disappear. Eventually, McCarthy's demands and Turner's fear reached a point where the two men could no longer continue as before. Their meeting at Boscombe Pool was therefore more than an ordinary disagreement. It was the final meeting between two men whose lives had been connected by a secret for many years. James happened to enter that history without understanding it. That was his misfortune. He saw only the last argument. He did not know what had come before. He could not understand why his father had behaved so strangely. He could not understand why his father had been so concerned about Alice, and because he knew nothing of the past, he could not explain the events to the police. The truth was, therefore, trapped inside a history that James had never been told. Holmes had to uncover that history himself. The Australian connection was the first door. The word cooey opened it. From there came the connection with the goldfields. Then came the relationship between McCarthy and Turner. Then the motive. Then the physical evidence. And finally, the confession. It was a beautiful chain of reasoning. I have seen Holmes solve more complicated mysteries. I have seen him deal with criminals of greater intelligence and situations of greater danger. Yet this case has always seemed particularly pure to me. The reasoning was almost visible. One could follow it step by step. That is why it made such an impression upon me. I also remember Holmes's attitude toward the confession. He did not display triumph. He did not boast. There was no theatrical declaration that he had conquered another criminal. Instead, he listened. Turner was an old man. He was seriously ill. He knew that his life was nearing its end. His confession had come because it could no longer allow James to suffer for his crime. Holmes understood this. He treated him neither with sentimental forgiveness nor with unnecessary cruelty. He simply established the truth, that was his way. As for myself, I could not help feeling some sympathy for the old man, though I could never excuse what he had done. The human mind is capable of carrying enormous burdens. Turner had carried his for years. He had built a new life over the ruins of the old one. But the foundation remained unstable. A single old acquaintance had been enough to bring the entire structure close to collapse, and when the collapse finally came, it took a life with it. I have sometimes wondered what might have happened if Turner and McCarthy had never met again after leaving Australia. Perhaps the murder would never have occurred. Perhaps James and Alice would have married without difficulty. Perhaps Alice would never have learned the darkest part of her father's history. Perhaps the old secret would have died quietly with the two men who carried it. Such thoughts belong to the world of imagination. Holmes dealt only with what had happened. He never wasted time asking how a case might have unfolded differently. His concern was always with the facts before him. There was wisdom in that. The past cannot be changed by examining it endlessly. It can only be understood, and sometimes understanding is the closest thing we can offer to justice. The release of James McCarthy was the most important result of our investigation. The young man had not killed his father. That fact mattered more than anything else. Whatever happened afterward, his life would continue without the shadow of a murder conviction. Alice would know that the man she loved had been innocent. The terrible suspicion that had fallen upon him had been removed. For Holmes, that was enough. He had never required applause. I remember that once the matter was settled, he seemed almost impatient to return to London. The countryside had given him the information he needed. The mystery was finished. His mind was already turning toward another problem. That was his nature. For me, however, the case remained. I continued to think about it during the evenings that followed. Sometimes I imagined the scene at the pool. Sometimes I thought about the footprints, but most often I thought about the lesson. A mystery is rarely solved by one extraordinary clue. More often, it is solved by a series of ordinary clues that have been correctly understood. Holmes had shown me this many times. Boscombe Valley simply presented the principle in its clearest form. The ground had spoken. The cigar ash had spoken. The Australian word had spoken. The dying man's broken utterance had spoken. Even the apparently suspicious behavior of James had spoken. The problem was that the voices had been misunderstood. Holmes had listened to all of them. That is perhaps the best way I can describe his genius. He listened, not merely with his ears, with his eyes, with his memory, with his reason, and with a patience that few people possessed. Years later, I began to record more of our adventures, I often found myself wondering which cases deserved to survive in writing. Some were dramatic, some were amusing, some involved remarkable criminals, but I felt that Boscombe Valley deserved its place because it demonstrated something fundamental about Holmes. He was not merely a solver of puzzles. He was a protector against false conclusions. That may sound like a small distinction. It is not. A false conclusion can destroy a man's reputation. It can separate families. It can send an innocent person to prison. And once accepted, a false conclusion becomes increasingly difficult to challenge. That was exactly what had happened to James. The first story told about him had been convincing. He had argued with his father. He had been nearby. He had blood on his hand. He had a gun. The story seemed complete. Holmes discovered that it was wrong. He did not need to invent a new story. He simply removed the assumptions that had been placed between the facts. That was enough. I have often wondered whether this was one reason Holmes disliked careless reasoning so strongly. A person who guesses too quickly can create an entire fiction without realizing it. The investigator's duty is to remain uncertain until the evidence gives him permission to become certain. Holmes followed that rule instinctively. It was perhaps his greatest professional virtue. As I write these memories now, the world in which the Boscombe Valley affair occurred has itself become a distant thing. The Victorian countryside has changed. The roads are busier. The old houses have passed through other hands. People who once knew the McCarthy and Turner families have long since gone. Even Baker Street, with all its memories, belongs to another age. Yet human nature has changed a little. People still make assumptions. They still conceal embarrassing truths. They still carry old resentments. They still judge others from appearances. And somewhere, I suspect, there are still quiet places where small traces of human actions remain waiting to be noticed. Perhaps that is why Holmes's methods remain so memorable to me. His greatest lesson was not that every mystery could be solved. It was that every mystery deserved to be examined honestly. We cannot always know the truth, but we can refuse to pretend that we know it before the evidence is complete. That principle served Holmes throughout his career. It served James McCarthy at Boscombe Valley. And it served me throughout the years I spent beside him. When I look back upon that adventure now, I do not think first of the murder. I think of the moment when the false story began to fall apart. I think of Holmes examining the ground. I think of the strange footprints. I think of the old Australian connection. I think of the confession. And finally, I think of the quiet relief that came with knowing that an innocent young man would not be punished for another man's crime. That relief is what remains. The tragedy cannot be erased. Charles McCarthy died. Turner's earlier crimes could not be undone. The pain caused to their families could not simply disappear. But the truth had been established. And truth, though it cannot repair everything, can sometimes prevent further harm. That was enough for Holmes. It was enough for me. So, when I remember the Boscombe Valley Mystery after all these years, I remember it not as a tale of violence, but as a quiet demonstration of the value of careful thought. The countryside was still. Pool was peaceful. The trees stood quietly above the path, and beneath them the smallest marks told the story. Sherlock Holmes had merely been willing to read it. Perhaps that is why the memory has remained so gentle, despite the sadness surrounding it. The case began with confusion. It ended with understanding. And after the final facts had been placed in order, there was nothing left for us to do but leave the valley behind. I remember the evening journey most clearly. The fading light over the fields, the distant sound of wheels, the gentle movement of the carriage. Holmes sitting quietly beside me, already turning his attention toward whatever problem awaited us next. I watched the countryside pass and felt the familiar sense that another chapter of a strange partnership had closed. There would be other mysteries, other journeys, other nights beside the Baker Street fire, other clues which at first appeared meaningless, but the memory of Boscombe Valley would remain with me. It reminded me that the truth does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes quietly. A footprint, a word, a little ash, a mark upon the earth, a detail everyone else has overlooked. And sometimes, if we are patient enough to notice, those small things can change everything. That, more than the identity of the murderer, is what I remember from the Boscombe Valley Mystery. It was one of those occasions when Sherlock Holmes showed me, once again, that the difference between confusion and understanding may depend upon nothing more than the willingness to look a little closer. The fire in Baker Street would burn again. The rain would return to the London windows. Carriage wheels would once more pass through the fog outside our rooms. And sooner or later another client would arrive with another impossible problem. But for that evening, there was peace. The case was finished. The truth had been found. And the long road from Boscombe Valley had finally brought us home. Fops Fari Pafokstar. Fops for 5. Formon, Verboekservaatschapper, Fops for 5. Fops for 5. Until we meet again, my dear friend, good night.